Welcome to another edition of God's Table Talk. This time our guest is Brad Cain. Now, you may see him if you're watching this on YouTube and you go, that guy looks familiar. Well, he's a professional wrestler. He had spent time in WWE and I believe WCW as well. And his stage name or his wrestling name was Lodi. Brad, thanks for coming to see us today.
Hey, Paul, thank you so much for having me, man. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Let's start kind of from the beginning. Give us a little background of your family and where you came from and how you got into wrestling, and then we'll jump into your testimony.
All right, we'll do that. I came from a little town in North Carolina, which didn't really have a whole lot going on. My family grew up on a farm. And, I graduated high school, went to college, East Carolina University, and always thought I was going to be a lawyer. Wanted to go to law school, got a degree in political science. But 2 years into my political science degree in East Carolina, I met a personal trainer who really inspired me to work out hard and get in shape. And I became a competitive bodybuilder, and I really couldn't wait to get out of college and open up a gym. And so that was some personal trainers weren't a big thing back in 1993. We were the first personal training business in Greenville, North Carolina. And after a couple of years of having a personal training gym, had a random guy stop by one day and wanted to know if we wanted to sponsor a local wrestling show and put an ad in the program or whatever. He started talking to me about wrestling. And as a kid, I grew up loving wrestling. I had a younger brother. We used to watch wrestling all the time until Mom caught us, and then she would forbid it to be watched in the house. And it's a funny story that she always talked about. I don't want you watching it. It's too violent. So wrestling wasn't permitted in our household, so we would sneak around to watch it. And we'd get caught, and inevitably here would be Mom with her speech again. And she hit us with it's fake and they're all friends anyway. And so when you hear this as an 11-year-old kid, you get kind of thrown. You're told it's fake. You told it's too violent. Well, how is it both of those things, So Mom was kind of contradicting herself a little bit. But funny story, once I started wrestling, I don't think Mom missed a show on TV anymore, but that's a little further down the road. So the guy that came in for the ad for his local wrestling, local promotion, wanted to know if I was interested in getting to wrestling because his wrestling trainer needed to get in some better shape. He said, maybe you guys could work out a deal. You could help him in the gym. He could teach you to wrestle. And it turned out to be C.W. Anderson, who later went on to work at ECW and became one of my lifelong friends. And so I trained with him. And funny story with that, I went to wrestling training for 2 weeks, 2 nights a week, drove about an hour and a half up to a little area called Smithfield, North Carolina. And CW had a wrestling ring inside of a barn on a nursery, big farm for plants, et cetera, whatever. And no heat, no air. And, we're in there, I thought, learning how to wrestle. And I went to my first 4 practices and I showed up for my 5th one and CW was already in the ring and I was getting ready to get in. And he looks over at me and he said, "You're going to keep coming, aren't you, kid?" And I'm like, yeah, I didn't understand where we were going with the question. He said, "All right, tonight we're going to learn how to wrestle." And I said, "Well, it's my 5th class. What have we been doing for 2 weeks?" He goes, "Oh, I was just beating you up to see if you'd quit." Right. "What do you mean?" He said, "I've been punching you and kicking you for 2 weeks." He goes, "That's not wrestling." He said, "I just wanted to see if you had the heart to stick around." And I'm like, I guess I'm too dumb to quit. Or I thought we were wrestling. I had no idea. So then I learned wrestling was just a little bit different than getting kicked and punched really hard. And so the coolest story, 2 months after that, I had my first wrestling match, and I'm not saying I was ready because I wasn't, but I went out there and did something. And fast forward the story a little bit, about a year and a half later, I ended up down in Atlanta trying out for the WCW Power Plant, which was their wrestling school, and a 3-day tryout that was harder than anything I did in basic training in the military. It was an absolute beast of a physical issue to get through. And in my class that came in, we had 27 guys start. At the end of 3 days, we had 3 guys left. And they only invited 2 of us back. So it was very hard and very difficult. And I realized after going to school there for a couple of months, the tryout was a really cool way for the school to make some money because every month they had 30 or 40 kids showing up, paying $250 a piece just to try out. And most of these guys quit by lunch the first day. It was a moneymaker because these kids were just coming in, throwing the money out. But my trainers down there, Sarge, who, you probably saw in WCW if you guys were fans, was instrumental in helping train Bill Goldberg, who was there at the same time I was. So Bill and I worked together a lot. Mike Winter was one of my trainers. And one of my favorite trainers down there at the time was Pistol Pez Watley. And I bring that up because just at WrestleMania last week, he got inducted to the Legacy Hall of Fame, which I thought was really cool and well-deserved. So went down to WCW to the power plant. I met Raven, who was a wrestler who just came down shortly thereafter. And he and I hit it off in a bar one night. He hired me as his personal trainer. And about a week later, he hired me to be his personal assistant. And 3 or 4 months later, he made a phone call to Terry Taylor, who was the booker at the time at WCW, and put me in the flock, or wanted to put me in the flock to replace Stevie Richards. And so the whole cool story about this is 2 years from the time I met CW and took my first bump in the ring, I was sitting at the Palace of Auburn Hills in front of 18,000 people in the arena on a pay-per-view for World Championship Wrestling that was seen by probably 10 million people worldwide. And it was a very fast ascent, and a lot of guys trained 12, 13, 14 years to get to that point. And I know now in hindsight and retrospect that it was obviously nothing I did. It was God's plan to get me there. And it's funny to look back and see how he used that. But at that time, of course, I thought it was all me. You know, I was giving myself all the credit for it. And to go back to my youth, I joke, but my mom and my dad were great. I grew up in a very Christian home. We had an open door church policy. If the church doors were open, we were there. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, potluck dinners on Saturday, vacation Bible school. It didn't matter what it was. We were in church. And so the sad part of my story is as I started wrestling and as I started traveling the world and on the outside, everybody saw that, you know, I was on MTV and VH1 back when they had guest VJs and played videos. They don't do that anymore, but, you know, doing cool things like that in magazines and on video games. Everyone who knew me thought, man, he really made it. You know, he's on top of the world. But the bad part in hindsight, looking at it, I was never further away from my walk with Christ as I was then, and I was really lost.
Where or when do you look back and say, this is when you became a believer? Was it when you were a kid, or was it after you got out of wrestling? Or I shouldn't say got out of wrestling, you're still in it, but you got out of the mainstream of wrestling where you were, you know, you were well known that way. When was it?
You know, Raven gives me credit for this. I grew up obviously in the church and believed, and you know, I was saved at an early age and believed in Jesus and never doubted that whatsoever. I just, like I said, when I started wrestling and my career started to take off, I started taking credit for everything I was doing and got further and further away from the things I knew I needed to be doing. And so my drug use was off the charts. My drinking was off the charts. Everything. I could not have been anything further. I still sin every day. But, you know, back then it was just wide open, out of control. And it's like I did everything I could to run away from Jesus. And the thing is, Christianity and praying in the Bible was not something that was talked about in the locker rooms, not on indie shows, not on big shows. It was kind of a taboo subject. And part of it probably was because of the lifestyle we were living. It didn't really coexist. You can't be one and part of the other. It just didn't go together. And so once I lost my job due to downsizing and probably part of my drug habit as well, I realized I needed to get my life back together and open a personal training studio. And I was still wrestling, but again, obviously not on TV anymore. And I had a client invite me to go to church, and I started going back to church in about 2005, 2006, and had a wonderful, wonderful pastor who I love to this day in the middle of this church. And I became a youth group leader at my church, and then started working as like I said, I was a youth group leader at my church, but then started speaking back in 2013. And normally for most months, I'll speak once or twice at churches. And so it was something that was ingrained in me at a young age that I ran from, and I kind of came back to, I would say probably 2006, 2007. And so again, in hindsight, I can look back and see all the mistakes I made, and not in a callous way, but I think one of the reasons I lost a lot of friends. And what I mean by that is lost them to death, drug overdoses, suicides. You know, wrestling business back in the late 90s, the drug use was so rampant, the death toll was super high. I've got a USA Today article that I carry around that I sometimes show when I go to speak that, you know, very few wrestlers, for all the people in the country that try to become wrestlers, make it to a TV level. It's a very elite group. And we had so many of those guys dying from 96, 97 up to 2001, 2002. This USA Today article said it would be the equivalent of 12 NFL players die in a month if you did the numbers. And the sad part about that is, as I watched my friends pass away and lose them, we would go to funerals, and I remember vividly going to funerals high. You know, it was just like, I can't believe so-and-so passed away. He was a bad drug addict. And here we are doing, 10 times as much. And I feel like the main reason, and I believe this in my heart, that God allowed me to live was to help younger people avoid some of the pitfalls and mistakes I made. And if I can save one person from that, all the stuff I went through was worth it.
Yeah, I know when I interviewed Nikita Koloff, and that's how I got your name. You and Nikita are good friends.
Yes.
That was one of the things I wondered about too, was did he become a believer because he watched so many of these wrestlers die? Because, of course, as you probably know, he went to high school with Kurt Hennig, Rick Rude. Yeah. I mean, and both those guys were at the pinnacle at one point in their profession, and they both died very early. Now, I don't know if they died from steroid use or if it was from using other drugs or what it was particular. But like you said, there was a span of about 5 years where there were some big name wrestlers who passed away, and people were like, wait a minute, what's going on?
Yes, sir.
So do you, because you have a wrestling school, how do you approach that when you're talking to young kids who are trying to get the competitive edge to reach that level? How do you talk to them about that?
I think throughout, especially since I started my speaking engagements and have been outgoing with my faith and explaining that to everybody, I don't hide anything I did in the past. And one of my fears, I've always expressed this, is when I talk to young kids and they hear that, I had a place I lived in Marina Del Rey, had a place on the beach there, and had a place at Carolina Beach. I was bi-coastal, which is, just the fact that I had two homes and more cars than I could drive and more toys that I could play with, more money than I knew what to do with. And so many people saw that as success. But we also know from a biblical standpoint, like I told you, I could not have been any further away from where I needed to be, or where Christ would find me, where he wanted me to be, or God's plan for my life. And so I try to almost downplay some of that, because I have young kids who've asked me time and time again, well, you didn't really clean up your life until your late 30s. Why can't I have fun now? And when I turn 38 or 39, I'll get clean like you did. I'll get sober then after I've had my fun. And I'm like, who says you're going to live that long? None of us are promised tomorrow. It's almost with my life. I was playing Russian roulette. Thankfully, I was able to live and didn't die. But there were nights where I passed out knowing I'm either not waking up tomorrow or I'll wake up in the hospital. I've done too much. This is it. And that's a scary thing. And it's not appealing, and it's not pretty, and it's ugly. I was speaking at a church in Metter, Georgia, just 2 nights ago, and I explained to them, and this is embarrassing for me to say at this point in my life, but at WCW, we have what was called a Deadpool list. We had a list of the next 5 guys we thought were going to die. I mean, how morbid is that? And if you were on the list one week and next week you got kicked off, you're wondering, hey, why am I not on the list this week? I mean, that's ridiculous. But that's the kind of envelope we were pushing with our drug use and just where we were mentally. So it's not a pretty sight. And so, again, with my kids now, I obviously tell them, I feel like in hindsight, had I not had the drug problems that I did and the demons that I battled with, I probably still could have wrestled a lot longer on TV with one of the bigger companies than I did, as opposed to having to, take some of these smaller tours and wrestle overseas and that kind of thing. So I feel very responsible for everything on that side that I did and the bad choices I made. And if I can help some of these young kids avoid those, then it's worth it. So
I know there are still some prominent wrestlers that are openly Christian, like Sting, Shawn Michaels. Yeah. I know that one of the stories that I've heard about Eddie Guerrero, the night before he died, or actually he was at a pay-per-view in Minneapolis, and his cousin found him, or his nephew found him dead in his hotel room the next day, was that Chavo went to look for him the night after the pay-per-view, because they were supposed to go have some dinner. And when he walked into the locker room, Eddie was actually testifying to Big Show. And so there's guys in the wrestling world who are preaching it and, trying to share it. I got to imagine it's got to be difficult, though.
It was, and the coolest thing, so a lot of the independent shows I do now are in the South, in North Carolina, South Carolina, some in Charlotte, Tennessee, Virginia. I travel some, but the majority of the shows I do are in the South, drivable 7, 8, 10 hours away. And it was so funny. So in 2011, 2012, I actually reconnected with a guy I broke into the business back early in 2000s named Scotty Matthews. And he and I had kind of went our separate ways. And when we bumped into each other again on the show, we started talking. And to my surprise, he had given his life to Christ. And I was just so happy for him because that was something we had never shared before. And I had gotten back into church and was doing everything I could to get back on the path where I needed to be. And he and I formed a tag team called Team Fearless. And the reason we called ourselves Fearless, and our mission statement was basically because we're fearless, stand on any street corner, any locker room, or any arena, and proclaim our love for Jesus Christ. And so the best thing about that is, as a TV character who was a bad guy coming out with a flock carrying signs that says, I hate this town, you people stink, those kind of things, I come out now and I have Bible verses on my signs. Every shirt we have, every picture we sell has a Bible verse on it. And it's so cool to be at some of these indie shows and meet these young kids. And sometimes they'll come up and they'll look at you and they'll look at your picture and they'll look at your shirt and like, you're a Christian? I'm like, yeah, I'm a Christian. You want to talk about it? And so it's really cool. And so we've taken something that we love, that God has given us the ability to do, and turn it into our way to spread the gospel. And so I think sometimes people maybe miss the calling on their life of what they could do and what they love, and putting them together and being able to be a Christian about it. I think a lot of times we first meet somebody and you're like, oh, I'm a talk show host, or I'm a professional wrestler, or I own a personal training studio. Very rarely do we say, hey, I'm a Christian who wrestles, or I'm a Christian who owns a personal training studio. Why do we hide that? Or why aren't we more forward and open about that, as opposed to who we are, when it's probably the most important decision we'll ever make in our lifetime?
It's an interesting thing you bring up, because I've done several interviews, and with men primarily, a lot of times their identity is tied up in what they do. And I think I hear it from you, and I heard it from Nikita. I've heard it from other people who said once they realized their identity was in Christ, then that little ego problem went away.
Yes, sir. The coolest story that Nikita and I shared together, and he may have shared this with you, did he explain to you about his first night ever wrestling? Did he tell you that story?
Oh, yeah. When he basically had no experience. They said, just don't.
None.
If he falls down when he walks through the ropes, he's out of the business.
Yeah, there is not a chance any major wrestling company puts a guy on TV today who's never been in a wrestling ring. It's the most absurd story you've ever heard, that he goes out and they tell the clothesline him and pin him, and that became the Russian sickle. And so, Nikita and I laugh about this all the time. And if he didn't tie these two things together, this is one thing that he and I both share. And we realized God had a different plan for our life while we thought we were becoming wrestlers. He made it in one night, basically. And in 2 years, I was at that level, which, again, both those things lightning fast and unheard of. But what was God preparing us to do? What did we do back then? We flew to a town. We performed in front of 18, 20,000 people we didn't know. We got into a rental car and went to a hotel and flew to the next town and did it again the next night. And I feel like, and Nikita and I have shared this when we speak together, that was God's way of getting us prepared for what we do now. Because what do I do now? I get in my car and I drive to a church, a congregation of 150 or 300 people. I don't know a single one of them. But yeah, I'm going to go in there and share the gospel with them. Or I go to a little league baseball tournament and give a message and a prayer, whatever it may be. And we don't have an issue of being in front of people because we spent so much of our life performing and feeling comfortable. That was God getting us ready for something in our life that we had no clue we were going to do when we broke into the wrestling business.
So now you have your own personal training business and your own wrestling school. In your personal training business, do you institute God into those things?
I do. I've got a Bible verse on the wall and a big picture right when you walk in the front door. It's one of the first things you see. It's, Philippians 4:13, and it's a big mural on the wall. And so I've got some different things put up here and there. And again, I wear the shirts with the Bible verse on it. And my clients, it's one of those things where if somebody brings me in to speak, they know what they're getting. when you come into the gym, I think you know what you're getting when you walk in the door. I was telling the story to a friend the other night. I spoke at a church. I was called in to speak at a high school in South Carolina a couple of years ago. And the night before, I get a call from the promoter that had set it up. He goes, "Hey, by the way, I just got a call from the principal. You've got to speak tomorrow. I was speaking twice. I'm speaking to the freshmen, sophomores, then junior, seniors. You can't use the word Jesus." Huh. Well, that's interesting. And my fear was not that I couldn't still be able to speak effectively. If I'm asked to not say something, I didn't want to necessarily go against what I was told and drop the name Jesus because I use it a lot and just not catch myself. And the promoter had this bright idea. He's like, "When they introduce you, come out with your signs and stick a Bible verse on there. Everybody will know." And I'm like, "Okay, that's a good idea." And the next morning I'm driving to the town, a couple hours away. The promoter calls me and goes, "Hey, the principal just called me and I ran the idea about the signs by him. No Bible verses." And I'm like, what am I going to do here? And so I call up a couple of my biblical mentors and they're like, "Hey, with the way you talk and the way you carry yourself, these kids are going to know. Just trust me on this." And Paul, it was so funny. I got out there and I walked out on stage and you got freshmen and sophomores. And it was a big double-decker auditorium. It was a big school, lots of kids. And probably half of them were on their phones. But when I walked out, and God, I know for a fact because I'm not this smart, I said, "Hey guys, before I start, there's one thing I always do at the end of my speaking. I always take a question and answer session. There are way too many of you out here today to me to get everybody to get a question from. So if you'll all go to my social media page and just send me a question there." And the promoter was off to the side and I saw him start chuckling because every day I put up a Bible verse and break it down. He goes, I came off stage. He goes, "How did you think of that? Because they go to your social media pages. They're going to know you're a Christian." I said, "It wasn't me. I had no plans of doing that. I walked out there and the good Lord just spoke through me." And I think it's amazing how he does that.
And of course, I've come to find out that it's much more important to live the faith instead of just speak the faith. And yes, I've seen it so often, people will become affected and I'll talk to them. I'll say, "Well, what did this person say? What scripture?" And they said, "They didn't give me a scripture. They just loved me." It's kind of like Nikita's story about going down and meeting up with Dusty Rhodes and Dusty going, "You drove 4 hours to have lunch with me and give me a book? Why?" Just wanted to love on you, man. I mean, that's really what it is for a lot of us.
You know what is so funny about that story? As I'm sitting here in my office, at that time, I was working for Dusty Rhodes. I was running his wrestling company called Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling. On the other side of this camera, there's a picture on my wall of Dusty Rhodes and Nikita and myself together. Very few people have a picture of those superpowers, when those guys got together. So that's one of my favorite pictures of all time. But I was there that day. And so that is a very true story and a real event.
You're a pretty big guy. You probably don't look that big when you're standing between Nikita Koloff and Dusty Rhodes, though.
It's funny. I did that was 20 years ago. It was 2001. So it's been 20 years, actually.
So let's talk about your personal walk. What do you do to continue to strengthen it with all that you're doing? I mean, you've got a lot of coals in the fire, so to speak.
I do. And I feel like, thankfully, I've done some work. Clayton King is a lead pastor at New Spring in South Carolina. And I attended, he had a year-long discipleship class that he puts on every year for young pastors and people who speak and that kind of thing. And he's a huge wrestling fan. And I'd met him several years ago. And I went through his course about probably 2 or 3 years ago. But I got in touch with him like, "Hey, would you take an old washed-up semi-retired wrestler for your discipleship course?" And between him and one of his best friends, Brian Burgess, who's another pastor, I really lean on those guys to help me, obviously in church and that kind of thing. And I've got some really good biblical mentors. I have a client who helped get me sober. I had stopped the drugs years ago, but continued to drink. And I had my last drink August 23rd of 2009. So I'm coming up on 12 years sober. And you go back, I got to take this from you, and you stole it from me, and I didn't even say it, but it's so true. People ask, how did Bob affect you? He'd been sober 30 some years. And how did he reach you when your friends sent you to this counselor and this therapist, and nobody else could ever reach you. And more so than any one thing he said, it was just the way he accepted me for the way I was and loved on me and shared some of his stories of when he was much younger, making a lot of bad mistakes. And he is such a strong Christian man now. And we did weekly Bible study together and that kind of thing. And he talked about my drinking habits were a whole lot like his. And no matter when I would try to stop, if I would ease back into it, I would end up back in that same old place. And for me, it was just best when I realized I couldn't do it. I'm not strong enough to handle it. And it's that thing they teach you in rehab, once too many, 1,000 is not enough. But I quit cold turkey, and I give Bob and God so much credit for that. But, the way he loved on me, that did so much more for me than some of the words he said. So you nailed it earlier. And that's the thing. I think a lot of people don't realize their actions and the way they treat others is more of a testimony than the words you may hear out of my mouth, especially if what I'm doing in my life doesn't match up to my words. Then you're being hypocritical, and that's even worse.
Well, I know that I read a story one time about Shawn Michaels, that when he became a born again, he was going to leave wrestling. And it was actually, I remember it was Ted DiBiase, or he went to a former professional wrestler who was a Christian and said, I don't think I can do this anymore if I'm going to be a Christian. And they said, no, you need to do this because God needs you in that locker room.
I totally agree. And so one of the cool things that's happened, in wrestling, they tell you, be nice to the guys on the way up the ladder because they're the same ones you're going to see on the way back down. And it's so funny to this day, I still, in the independent scene in the Carolinas and the South, I still run into guys who were there before I ever made it. Back in 95 and 96, who knew me before I was ever Lodi on TV, back when I was still raising Kane, which was my first wrestling name. It was one of those things back then, there was, Triple H was Terra Rising. You put two names together it's hokey as it can be, I know. And so, but you see these same guys, and it's funny how much in the independent locker rooms, a reputation that myself and Scotty had fostered among the guys and a respect level. We can be in a big locker room, and some of the young kids may be in there, not know we're on the other side, or there's blockers in between us. And you'll hear somebody, use some language they probably shouldn't, which wrestling locker rooms are like the military, some of the worst language you can imagine. And it never fails. Somebody's like, hey, Lodi's in here. Sorry, Lodi. And all of a sudden you hear him apologize. And I don't have to say a word. It's the greatest thing ever that, these young kids will get onto a guy for cussing in my presence. And so that kind of thing, just the way we carry ourselves and the way we pray before our matches. And then to continue that, it's not just, I've had one or two independent wrestlers send me a note on Facebook or message me like, hey, that God gimmick looks pretty cool. Are you making some money with it? I'm like, brother, that's not my gimmick. That's my life. And they're like, what? You're not just using that to make money? It's like they really thought it was, if I didn't know them, like, somebody from Washington or whatever just sees it. And they're like, I just thought that whole thing was a gimmick. You're really a Christian? I'm like, yeah, that's really me. That's my whole life thing there. So it's interesting that you nailed that. And it's one of those things where the way you carry yourself, people see that and they believe a whole lot more what you do than what you say sometimes.
I guess it's one of the things that I've always had, because when I got saved a little over 20 years ago at the church that I still go to, the senior pastor at that time, he would always say, spread the gospel to all the world and when necessary, use words.
I love it. I have heard that before too. I have one quick story I've got to share that meant so much to me. There's a group I wrestle for a couple of times a year down in Texas. They're in Rockwall, which is a suburb of Dallas, called the Christian Wrestling Federation. And the owner, Rob Vaughn, is one of the owners. His wife's dad is in his late 80s now, and just a great man of God, and led one of the biggest churches for the deaf in Texas for 30 some years. And one of the first times my partner and I met him, we actually when we go down, they'll put us up with one of the church families or whatever for the weekend. And we got to stay with Ben's dad. His name was Johnson. And Johnson took such good care of us. We just, he asked about us, Scotty and I. He was so interested in our lives, and he would not talk about himself. And so we finally nailed him down more and took a breath. Just like, Johnson, you've heard all about us. We want to hear about you. And my partner asked him, he said, Johnson, you've been a man of God your entire life. And said, if you had to give us the Cliff Notes on the Bible. What would you say is the biggest takeaway right now? And he looked for a second, Paul, and he looked at us and he goes, love everybody. Let God take care of the rest. And, you know, and Scott and I are both sitting there like, man, that's short and sweet and really profound, you know, because there are a lot of things people have an issue with, you know, someone's lifestyle or what they're doing, but you don't have to love what they're doing, but we got to love them. And so I think that goes back to the way you were saying earlier, the way we carry ourselves and love others, which is what Jesus asked us time and time again to do. And so sometimes, like you said, that makes a much more profound effect on someone than just the words we may use.
So I ask this question towards the almost every interview I do.
Okay.
When you were 18 years old, you saw your life going a certain way. As you talked about, you were going to be a lawyer. Now you're midlife, let's say.
Yes, sir.
How different is it? And is it met your expectations of what your life would be like?
Paul, at 18, you know, my delusions of whatever may be or was going to be, I could have never in a million years ever guesstimated this farm boy from a small town in North Carolina that didn't even have a name, you know, just small area, would ever travel the world and be a professional wrestler and have a platform like I do to not only speak to people, but help people and hopefully lead them to Christ. And one thing about what we do now is going into these, you know, when I go to events and I sell merchandise before the show at intermission, you know, try to talk to these people. Some people either need to hear about Jesus again or maybe hear about Jesus for the first time. But to take something that I love, wrestling, and combine it with my love for God and my love for Jesus and my love for others, and to be able to get paid to do those things, I jokingly tell people, Paul, I've never worked a day in my life. I've had 2 jobs. I've been a professional wrestler and I've had a personal training gym. I love working out. It's fun for me. Helping other people get in shape is fun for me. And with that endeavor and with wrestling, I can share the gospel all day long. And so, no, I jokingly tell people, like, the plan that God had for my life, I could have never dreamed that at 18 years old. There's no way. And the things he's done with me and for me, you know, again, the more I learn about him, the more it's easier for me to give him credit and realize that I'm just a dirty old sinner that he decided to bless. So, yeah, I could have never imagined the stuff I've been able to do and places I've been able to go and people I've been able to meet. There's no way. Not without him.
Is there a scripture verse that you go through your head when you're like, it just automatically pops in your head when because there is struggles, obviously.
Right. You know, Philippians 4:13 is one we use all of my merchandise for my shirts and my pictures and that kind of thing, because it really resonates. And then I have such a strong bond with Scotty Matthews. Is, you know, iron sharpens iron. Proverbs 27:17 is one we both lean on a lot, because I have been blessed with such great biblical mentors and people who've helped me. And you mentioned Nikita's name and us being friends. Nikita was the first grown adult other than my dad that ever scared me to death. You know, I never forget, we used to go to the Greensboro Coliseum once a month. So I grew up watching Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes and Nikita Koloff. And so to end up being friends with those guys and Arn Anderson and train their kids and wrestle with them and wrestle with their kids, who could dream that up and think that could be real life for me? And that's something that only God could do. But, you know, we sat down front one time. Dad's, you know, like, so we always like, I was like sit in the middle, got to look up, I was looking down, but I was saying, Dad, I was a big football player in high school. And like to see how big those guys are up close. And I'm standing up against the rail, and here comes Nikita. And, you know, Nikita about this time is like 298, 300 pounds. I took a couple of steps back. I was like, whoa. I mean, he laughs about that to this day, but he was the first grown man that ever scared me to death other than my dad, because he was a monster, you know. And so, yeah, I have, again, a blessed and charmed life.
So what is the future for you, Brad?
I hope to keep wrestling for a couple more years. I know I've got way more years behind me than do in front of me. I don't know what that looks like due to all the injuries and stuff I've had. I've really had to scale back on what I do in the ring now. I've had 3 neck surgeries and had some pretty serious things happen that had to tone down my style some. But with my training the kids and hopefully turning out a new crop of guys who are not only great wrestlers, but also godly men. That's kind of my idea. And obviously, as long as people will have me to continue to speak and share the gospel in those churches that will bring me in. I've been asked a couple of times, do you ever feel led to lead a church? And I just never had that heartstring. Those have never been pulled on me, but to go and speak and travel and speak to different people, that's kind of where my heart is. And so I've enjoyed doing that. So that's what the future holds for me, I think. And at some point we got to get this thing on retirement, which wrestlers don't talk about very often. We got to give that a serious talk, or some serious thought. I just don't know when that is.
Thank you for tuning in to God's Table Talk. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Anchor, and you can watch the full interview on YouTube. I'm your host, Paul Leck. Be blessed, but more importantly, be a blessing.